All right. Well, hello, everybody. And thank you so much for joining me for this session on finding your African American ancestors. My name is Adrienne Whaly, and I am a genealogist and family historian. I've been researching my own family history for almost 20 years at this point. In addition to doing all of that work, I also am a museum educator and specifically a history museum educator. My background is in African American studies, and so you can see how all of these things really come together when it comes to dealing with African American ancestry. Now, it's Black History Month. My background is in African American studies. I've been researching my own African American ancestry. But let me say right now that even if you don't have African ancestry in your own background, even if you don't, for example, identify as a person of African descent or African American, there are still tools and tricks and tips and resources in this presentation that might be useful for you. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the challenges that people face when it comes to doing African American genealogical research? So, one thing that I've often heard is, why would I want to do that research? My family were slaves. And so there's the sense that maybe there's something shameful, maybe there's something embarrassing, or maybe it's just plain unexciting to do this research. I've also heard from people, well, that research isn't possible, right? Because we were slaves and so no records exist. Well, number one, a lot of records actually do exist, both because slavery did end. And so there are lots of records created after the period of enslavement, but even during the period of enslavement, when people of African descent here in the United States were considered as property, you could actually find some records about them. They were just located in property records. So it might not be the most comfortable thing to see, but that doesn't mean that those records don't exist. I've also frequently heard, and this is a really popular one, it's just all of this is too overwhelming. I don't know how to get started. I don't know where to look. I have no idea how to begin. And so all of those things together can often serve as reasons why people choose not to try to start this research. So, why would you bother digging in? Well, here's why I choose to dig in. So I've got two biological parents, right? I've got four biological great grandparents. I've got eight biological great grandparents, and 16 above that, and 32 above that, and so on and so forth. And all of those people had siblings, right? So I want to know who they were. I want to know what their stories were. I want to know what made them who they ended up becoming. I want to know what they went through. I want to know the joys. I want to know the challenges. I want to know the struggles. I want to know how all of those people somehow filtered down through the generations to create me. How did I end up here? What is my story? So the folks that you see on screen are numbers of individuals in my own family. These are folks on both my father's side, on my mother's side, people whose stories I've really been digging into because I want to understand, how did I become who I am? How did my parents become who they were? How did every generation of my family make it through all of the things that they made it through to thrive and survive? So here's what we're going to talk about in this session, which is going to last approximately 30 to 40 minutes. So first, we're going to review the basics. We're going to talk about getting back to 1870. We're going to talk about slavery era research. We're going to talk about some basic tips, some easy tricks, resources, just some basic knowledge on how to do this research. We're going to talk about the danger of assumptions, which is really key. And then we're going to talk about the importance of historical context. Now, my expectation at the end of this is not that you all are coming out of this as experts, but that you're excited, that you're energized, that you feel like this research is possible, and like you've got the basic skills necessary to start putting together a research plan, to start going out and interviewing folks and looking for information so that you can build your own family trees. So let's talk about those basics. So, number one, and you're going to hear every genealogist that you speak with tell you this, start with yourself and work backwards. So, why would you do this? Well, There are lots of folks who get really excited. They have a last name that maybe is tied to somebody who is wealthy, somebody who is famous, somebody who made a significant mark on American history. And so they say, I want to know about that person because I know for sure that I'm connected to them. And so they start doing all of this research. And lo and behold, at some point, what they discover is that they are not related to that person. So all of the time, all of the energy that they put into that research, all of the maybe money and resources that they put into that research, down the drain because it wasn't their actual family. So start with yourself and work backwards. Make sure that you are connecting yourself to your parents. Make sure that you connect your parents to their parents, and so on and so forth. Number two, interview your family. So I would say start with the folks in your family who are your elders. Start with the folks who are the oldest in your family. Start with the folks in your family who maybe are losing their memories, or the folks who maybe are physically frail, maybe the folks that you're not sure if they're going to honestly be around for much longer. There is an old proverb that I've heard that says, when an elder dies, a library burns. Imagine all of the stories that the elders in your family have in their heads. Imagine all of the family connections that they know about. Imagine all of the experiences that they've been through. You want to make sure that you're able to record those things, because if you don't do it now, you might miss out on the opportunity. And I would even say you've got a number of different ways that you can do this. So you could do it with a basic, paper and pen, right? Paper and pencil. You could use your phone or any sort of like an audio recorder, cassette recorder, or something like that. At this point, you can actually Zoom with somebody or use some other sort of video conferencing so that you can record and interview someone who's all the way across the country from you. And don't feel like you have to do it all in one piece. You can do it over multiple sessions. I've actually even interviewed people over email when I knew that that would be easier to get some of the basic information that I really wanted to make sure that I got. But there definitely is a lot of value to making sure that you can get your ancestors or your elders' voices recorded. If you can make sure that future generations of your family have access to that, imagine how meaningful that's going to be for them. So definitely make sure that you interview members of your family. There are lots of resources available online. If you look up, for example, family and oral history, or family interview questions, or any sort of combination of similar words, you're going to get all sorts of wonderful lists for the kinds of questions that you might want to start asking, so that you can trigger memories and really get some interesting stories out of the folks that you're talking to. You also want to make sure that you don't just focus on direct ancestors. And so when I say that, what I mean is that when we think about genealogy, we often think about something like this chart that you see, which is called a pedigree chart. And so what you'll see is that you've got a space for your name. If you're married or partnered, you've got a space for your spouse. And then you also have a space for your father and for your mother. And if you have a non-traditional family, there are certainly ways that you can modify these charts to reflect what it is that you need to reflect. So if you continue going up the line, you might have yourself, you might have your father, you might then have his parents, and then you might have their parents, and so on and so forth. But who's missing? All of the siblings, all of the cousins, all of the aunts and uncles. And they're all a part of the family story, right? And in fact, it's possible that things passed down through the family that didn't come down your direct line. They actually went to maybe somebody's brother or sister, aunt or uncle, cousins, or something like that. So they descended down a different branch of the family. So if you're not talking to those folks, the cousins, the aunts and uncles, and so on and so forth, you might be missing valuable information. This is why people often recommend that you use something called a family group sheet or a family group record, like what you see here on the right. And this gives you an opportunity to see not only the two adults in the family, but also all of the children. And so if you fill this out in relation to each of the individuals that you see on a pedigree chart, one where you have them as the adult in the family as the parent, and one where you have them as the child in the family, then you're able to see who the siblings, who the cousins, who the aunts and uncles are as you go back in each generation. Now, charts like these can be found all over the place on the internet. You can find them on familysearch.org, for example. You can find them on ancestry.com. You can find them on lots of other websites, both free and paid. So if you already have a subscription to someplace, you can check that out. If you don't, just search for free pedigree chart, free family group record, and you will find some resources out there. Okay, so what comes next? As you were interviewing your family members, as you're starting to fill out these pedigree charts and these family group sheets, you're going to be getting lots of family stories. And here's the thing, you cannot take all of those family stories as gospel. Take them all with a grain of salt. People remember things differently. Memories change over time. Different people who were involved in the same circumstance or the same event might have different perspectives on what happened. So, see if you can get multiple perspectives on the thing right from the beginning and see what documentary evidence you can pull to back up whatever family stories you hear or to disprove whatever family stories you hear. Go into it as though it is just a story that you are being told. Look for other information that is either going to prove or disprove, but don't necessarily assume that it is true or false going in. Just listen and keep an open mind and then see what other information you can find. Make sure that you're verifying family relationships. So a lot of us probably have play aunts and uncles, right? Or we've got like cousins that aren't actually blood related. Those people are very important to keep in mind as you're doing your research, and you'll see why in just a second. But make sure that you know for sure how the different people are related to you. Make sure that you ask those questions. And whenever you've got like your aunt so and so, where you don't actually know what her full first and last name are, just ask those questions, get it out of the way, get all that information, write it down, keep it moving. And so don't forget fans. So what does this mean? Well, going back to those play cousins, play aunts and uncles, FAN stands for friends, associates, and neighbors. These are the folks who were involved in your family's life. These are the folks who know stories about the people in your family, even though they're not blood relations. They're the best friends. They're the folks who lived next door for 40 years and saw everybody coming and going. As you're doing your research, keep in mind the fact that people often move in clusters. Keep in mind the fact that people build these rich relationships with folks outside of the family. And so see as you're researching, what those names are for the people who are living nearby, who seem to keep showing up in photos. Make sure that you get information about them as well, because you never know when that's going to open a really interesting door for you. And then finally, explore personal archives. So, as you are doing your oral history research, as you're interviewing family members, ask them if they've got photo albums. Ask them what documents they have. What do they keep in shoe boxes under their beds? What's tucked away in file boxes in their basement or in their attics? You might be surprised and fascinated by the things that you discover that they have. And they might be things that these folks forgot that they had or didn't think were that important. But number one, you never know what stories will be unlocked when you discover a paper, a military medal, a photograph, a birth certificate. Who knows what you might discover? Plus, they might have documents that you might otherwise have needed to pay good money for to send away to a specific archive or to a vital records place or to a courthouse or so on and so forth. So always ask if you can explore the personal archives before you really start going out and digging into other sources of information. And then finally, cite your sources. Actually, this is not finally, this is second to last for this. Cite your sources, because there's nothing worse than finding a great thing and then forgetting where you got it from when you want to go back and get more information from it. It is so frustrating to think, oh, well, I know that I found this record in a book, but which book was it? And who had that book? So as you're finding documents, as you're finding information, use some sort of a system, either in the cloud, on your computer, in a ancestry program, on somebody's website, or just in a notebook and in a file system to make a notation of where you found, right down to the file folder, to the page number, whatever level of detail you can get to so that you know how to find it when you go back and look. Make sure that you do that. And then finally, back everything up. So Worst case scenario, your home goes up in flames. All of the documents that you kept are burned in the fire. All of the time, all of the energy, all of the money that you put into this research, gone. So what you want to make sure that you do is that you keep backups. So for example, I make sure that I've got an external hard drive that has my information in it. I make sure that I have flash drives that have my family tree on them. I also make sure that I back up all of my information, including family photographs, in the cloud. So let's say something happens to my home. Let's say something happens to my computer. I've got backups in different places because again, that money, the time, the energy, all of that effort, you don't want to lose it just because a magnet was too close to your hard drive or something. And then just keep going. So you've gathered your information, you've answered a research question, you've documented where you found the information, you've made sure that you backed it up. Go back to the family members that you've been interviewing and ask them follow-up questions. See what other questions you have and just keep building and building and building to see what you can build in terms of the breadth of your family story and the depth of your family tree. Just keep it going. So, what are the sorts of sources that you're going to look for? So, let's start at the beginning, vital records. Birth, marriage, divorce, and death records. These are sort of the basics that are going to be kept essentially across the country, generally speaking, starting from around the turn into the 20th century. So, about the early 1900s to the 19 teens. Some major cities, towns, metropolitan areas will have been keeping some of this information earlier. Sometimes churches will have a lot of good vital records, so those might go even earlier. But you want to make sure you find these because these are sort of the building blocks. This is going to give you essentially the skeleton of each individual's life that you're researching. Census records are going to start to help you fill in some of those years in between. The federal census begins in 1790. It's taken every 10 years, so 1800, 1810, and so on and so forth. It's useful to know that the 1890 census was mostly destroyed by a fire and then the water damage that came from putting out that fire. So there is a bit of a gap from 1880 to 1900. That doesn't mean that all of the 1890 records are gone. It is still worth checking to see if they exist for the locales that you're researching. And there are also some substitute records that you can find in a variety of locations. It's also useful to know that aside from the federal census records that are taken every 10 years, a number of states and other localities would do other census record taking in the sort of in between years. So there's some places that for example, did that in 1885 instead of 1880 and 1890, and then would do it again 1895, 1905, 1915, and so on and so forth. And that can really help you to narrow down sort of the time and the place where your ancestors are so that again you're putting some meat onto the skeleton of their lives. City directories and phone books are a great way to track sort of the in-between years for what's happening in between the census records. You will be able to find city directories for a number of major cities for a great span of time, definitely the 20th century, definitely the 19th century, for some places, maybe even the late 18th century. And then phone books, of course, are more recent, and you're able to find a lot of information in those. And you can find a lot of these things online. You can find them in local libraries, historical societies, and all sorts of places like that. You're going to want to check military records. You're going to want to look at land and property records, right? Where are people living? Did they buy a house? When did they buy it? Who did they buy it from? Maybe they actually purchased it from a relative. You can find out maybe did they make changes to their home? What sort of tax payments were they making on the property? What was it worth? There's lots of pieces to the story that you can start to build out. Maybe your ancestor owned land in a time when it was actually unusual for people of African descent to own land. So what else can you find out about that story? Look for religious records. You want to look for baptismal records. Again, vital records might come up in churches and other religious organizations. Look for education and employment records. So, what can you find about where your ancestors and family members went to school? What about where they worked? Is there a newspaper for the industry that they worked in, or even a magazine for the specific business that they worked for? You never know what you might find that's going to tell you more about your ancestors' life experience. And then newspapers are a gold mine of information. And we'll talk a little bit about some more of these sources as we get later into the presentation. So let's see. What else do we want to dig into? Well, context. So the basics are sort of what are the kinds of resources that you want to look at, but then how do you understand what those mean in the time period in which your ancestors lived? So it's important as we think about people of African descent to remember that as we're looking at their experiences in the United States, you're going to come across some difficult things, right? So we're going to have to grapple with slavery. We're going to have to grapple with racism. We're going to have to deal with Black codes and Jim Crow and segregation and inequality. And frankly, we're going to have to deal with state sanctioned, community supported violence. We're talking lynchings and the burning of towns and all sorts of things like that. Now, the flip side of that is that while really challenging things happened, people of African descent in the United States found ways to survive, found ways to thrive, and found ways to support each other as they went through these so that they could build communities, so that they could build families, and so that they could build meaningful lives. So, for example, they're developing African American churches. They're developing mutual aid societies that function as early almost insurance companies. They're creating their own educational institutions or helping to co found ones that are founded by white individuals, particularly through churches. They're publishing their own newspapers. They're even coming up with all sorts of things to help them in sort of the daily nitty gritty of life. For example, if you want to travel to see family members, how do you know where it's safe to go? How do you know which restaurants you can stop at? How do you know which hotels you're able to stay in? Something like the Negro Motorist Green Book is going to be a thing that's going to tell you that. And so these are resources that are created by African Americans for African Americans so that they can truly live a good life. If you want to understand the stories of your ancestors, you're going to have to dig into this context, both the challenging side of it as well as the positive side of it, to really understand what their stories look like. And then what else? Well, you need to look at timelines. So, genealogy is a historical discipline. And so, you need to understand for the stretch of your ancestors' life, what are the major things that are happening in American history? What are the major things that are happening in African American history? What are the major things that are happening in world history? What's happening internationally? Because those things are probably in some way going to impact your ancestors' life. Maybe it's just that they're reading about whatever it is all the time in the newspaper, but maybe they're being recruited or drafted to serve in a war. Maybe something fascinating is happening with women's rights, and so the women in your family are involved. Maybe they're involved in the civil rights movement. Maybe there was a natural disaster and it displaced your family. So make sure that you're looking at timelines for all the different levels, right down even to the state, to the county, to the city, to the town, to whatever the region it is, so that you can really understand what their lives might have looked like. And that really is getting us into that next point, because you never know how the hyper local is going to determine what your family's story was. And then finally, look for reference books. So, really, as you're considering yourself to be a genealogist, remember that a genealogist, a good one, is also a historian. So, seek out blogs, seek out books, seek out podcasts, seek out videos, look for all the different things that are going to give you stories and information about what the time period was like, what gender roles were like, what the geography was like, and so on and so forth. But as you're doing your research, there's a couple of things that you're going to want to be aware of and just beware of. So, number one, false assumption: records weren't kept. So, this is not true. Lots of records were kept. Now, they can be spotty sometimes, they can be challenging, but They do exist in a number of cases. For example, this is a document. It's called, quote unquote, An Account of My Negroes. It's a logbook from 1715. And what you can see is that it's got listed out the names of enslaved people who are owned by a certain person. This is from a Georgetown project related to slavery. It's a slavery archive for Georgetown University. And so this is one of the records that's been helping them to understand the story of their university in relation to the lives of enslaved people. And again, 1715. So records were kept. Where might you find these records? Well, tax lists, estate inventories, plantation and farm ledgers. Go to the archives for whatever the region is that you're researching, both at the city or the town level, at the county level, and at the state level. Don't forget to check online as well as in physical locations. And don't forget college and university archives. And you might have to do some creative searching because sometimes records end up in university archives that actually are not close to the location of the person who donated the material. Maybe the person started off in Arkansas and moved to New York City. Maybe they donated their materials to New York, but they were actually about the person's early life in Arkansas. So you're going to have to do some creative searching to think about geography and where places might have where people might have placed the materials that are important to their lives. Think about the pathways that people traveled and where along that path they might have left their resources and information. Other false assumptions you want to pay attention to, be mindful of, and try not to lean into too hard. So, Native American ancestry, and in particular, oftentimes people have stories about relationship to, for example, the Cherokee Nation and sometimes to Cherokee royalty. Okay, so it's important to recognize that there are hundreds of different Native American groups that have existed over the history of the United States. And so, what you need to be aware of is who was where at the point in time when your ancestors were living there. One way to do this is to consult maps. And so you'll see the map that I've pulled up. It's called a map of the Indian tribes of North America around 1800. And so this map is actually showing you, based on the different colors, the different nations and where they're living. So look for the maps that are going to show you, for the region that you're exploring, who were the native peoples who were there at the time that your ancestor was there. And that's going to help you to understand whether these stories about Native American ancestry have maybe a basis in truth. There's a lot of intermixing between people of African descent and Native Americans. And so it's just a matter of sussing out, is it likely for your family in particular? And is the nation that you've heard actually the nation that was likely mixed with your family? There's ways that you can find these maps. A couple of my favorite sources for maps in general are the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, and the David Rumsey Historical Map Collection. Other false assumptions that you should be aware of. All of my people were enslaved. So there have been free people of African descent since the colonial era. There were free people of African descent during the Revolutionary era. There were free people of African descent leading all the way up to the end of the Civil War. There were different numbers of them in different places at different times. And so again, the contextual research for your location is going to be really important, but you shouldn't necessarily make the assumption that every branch of your family descends from somebody who started off enslaved, or that all of them all across time were enslaved people. They might have been manumitted at some point in time for a variety of reasons if they were enslaved to begin with. The flip side of that is that none of my family were enslaved people. And, you know, this is a thing where oftentimes people are really, really proud to say this. And it's a beautiful thing if you do have family members who were not enslaved. That's a wonderful piece of your family history that you should celebrate. But again, we should remember that there's nothing to be ashamed of when it comes to the enslavement of our ancestors, right? The fact that we are here is a living testament to the fact that they were strong, that they were wily, that they did what they needed to do, and that they survived. So if you have heard maybe that none of your family were enslaved, just keep in mind the relative number of free people of African descent related to the number of enslaved people in American society. Think again about the region, think about the time period that you're talking about, and then really just do your research. Don't go into it with any assumptions, just do the research, go where the evidence takes you, and use a critical eye and critical thought to suss out what you're looking at. And then finally, all of my ancestors were Christian. There has been diversity in African spiritual practice for centuries. We know for a fact, for example, that there were people who were practicing Islam in the early United States. And so, as you're thinking about the places that your family members may have worshiped, as you're thinking about the languages that they may have spoken, as you're thinking about the spiritual beliefs and practices that they may have had, don't necessarily assume that they were in the same church that you were in. Don't necessarily assume that they attended church. They may have had any number of different spiritual practices that were guiding them through life. A couple of other things to keep in mind. You're going to come across segregated records. It's very, very likely. For example, what you can see on the right-hand side is something that I found when I was doing research in Alabama. You can see that these are dockets for colored, quote unquote, people for marriage records. Now, the flip side of that is that sometimes people who were, quote unquote, colored, people who were African American, for example, sometimes they passed. Or sometimes people made a visual identification that was incorrect. Sometimes the records just get sort of mushy. And so if you don't find someone in the place where you would expect to find them, look in the other place just to be sure. And then don't assume because you found them in one place at one time that they are always categorized in the same way across time. Just again, open mind, go where the resources lead you, keep checking, and then double check your assumptions as you go through. A couple of books that you might want to start with, and these are really just like this is the tip of the iceberg. There is a wealth of books out there that are focusing on helping people of African descent to dig into their genealogy and their family histories. But a couple of good places to start might be with Tony Burrow's book, Black Roots. Robin Smith has a wonderful blog called Reclaiming Kin, and she's taken some of her best, most helpful blog posts and turned them into the best of Reclaiming Kin. There's also an amazing book called D. Palmer Woodter called Finding a Place Called Home, a guide to African American genealogy and historical identity. These are just some places to, again, go through basic tips and tricks in more detail, think more about sources for information, and just really help you to sort of order your research steps. You also want to look at websites, and these are just a few of the ones that are available out there in the world. Cindy's List in particular has a wonderful compendium broken down by category that you can just keep going deeper and deeper and more specifically into to find exactly the sorts of resources that you're looking for. Afrogenius is a really helpful one for people who are specifically focusing on African American research. And there's a number of other websites out there that you can dig into. Just Googling African American genealogy is going to take you down some wonderful research paths. There's a lot of blogs and other media out there. I mentioned Reclaiming Kin. That's one great blog that exists. Kinterested is actually my personal blog where I mostly share stories about my own family history as I uncover them so that I can make sure that family members all across the nation are able to access the information that I'm finding, since it shouldn't just be sort of in my head and on my computer. So I encourage you all to check that out just to see sort of how I'm using resources, how I'm pulling together stories, how I'm choosing to share it, and so on and so forth. But I also check out these other resources to learn from them. So definitely consider them to be great resources. Newspapers are a wonderful resource for primary sources. And some of these articles that you see here are ones that are specifically about members of my family. Now, we know that there are newspapers that exist that were specific to African American communities, but a couple of things that you want to remember. So, number one, you should also look for your African American ancestors in the sort of wider spread newspapers of note for different locations, because it's quite possible that they were mentioned in those larger newspapers for their communities. You also want to make sure that you're not focusing just on the sole location where you know that your ancestors lived. For example, there are African American newspapers that publish information from all over the nation. If it rises to something that they consider to be newsworthy because it's political, because it's about something really interesting, social, or whatever it is, you will find newspapers carrying information from all across the country, and people will be republishing things that they've seen in other places. So definitely keep that in mind. Some places that you can find Black newspapers. One of my favorites is Chronicling America, which is a service of the Library of Congress. And so I've pulled up that page just so that you can see one of the wonderful things about this free resource. So what I love about it is that you can access a number of newspapers. You can see the full digital images for these papers going back a significant amount of time, all the way back to at least 1789. But what's really cool about this is that in addition to the newspapers that they have digitized, they will also tell you about all of the newspapers that have been published from 1690 to the present day in the United States. And so you can see there's a little button on the previous page that says Use US Newspaper Directory 1690 to present. If you click that, it's going to take you to this page. And then there's a number of different search categories that you can select. And in fact, you can actually focus specifically on African American newspapers. You can focus specifically on particular locations and so on and so forth. So it's a really, really cool resource. If you want to focus specifically on African American newspapers, ProQuest has a wonderful resource focusing on those Black newspapers, and you can access those through colleges, university libraries. If you live near a major city or have access to a major city's library, you can also often access it through there. You also want to pay attention to military records. So oftentimes you will find photos in your family photo albums. Maybe someone's got a certificate of military service on a wall. Maybe there's a medal tucked away in a box. There's all sorts of stories that you can find. Maybe there's a letter that's been tucked away in a shoebox for a long time from maybe World War I or World War II. People of African descent have served in every war that the United States has been involved in, including wars from before the United States was an actual nation. People of African descent were involved in colonial militias, for example, and were involved in the French and Indian War. And these are just a number of the specifically African American regiments that existed, or the ones that were predominantly African American, such as the First Island Regiment, First Rhode Island Regiment during the Revolutionary War. So seek out these resources. You can find a number of them through the National Archives and Records Administration. And you can see that I've taken you right to this page here, www.archives.gov/research/military. And you can start to dig into, okay, what are the records that NARA has when it comes to the military? Now, what about Reconstruction and Jim Crow? So we're thinking about the time period that comes right after the Civil War. We're talking like the 1870s to like the 1890s, we'll say. So what can you find there? Well, you can absolutely find records for the Bureau of Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Land, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, which was meant to help people of African descent, as well as people who were displaced after the Civil War, to help them to sort of get on their feet, to get them work contracts and all sorts of things like that. The Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company, which is also known as the Freedmen's Bank, was a place where people of African descent after the Civil War were able to deposit their money. And so they had to fill out applications when they opened accounts. The Southern Claims Commission is another place that you can look for information. This is people who had maybe had their land confiscated, had their crops taken, had their livestock taken, and they're petitioning the United States government in order to get their funds back. So you want to check out the Southern Claims Commission because you will be able to find lots of wonderful information about who these people were, what happened to them, what are they asking for, and especially if their original petition is rejected, they then have to submit another application that has even more information. So while it would have been frustrating and probably very, very difficult in the past for them, if their application had been rejected, as a genealogist for you in the present day, there's actually probably more information. It's probably more of a boon for you if it was rejected. So these are all things that you can look for. And you can find a lot of this information through the National Archives and Records Administration. You can also find a lot of it on familysearch.org and on ancestry.com, as well as several other websites. If you Google the names of any of these organizations, you will be able to find out where you can find information both that is transcribed as well as information that you might have to browse page by page through. What else for Reconstruction and Jim Crow? Well, we know again that there is state sanctioned violence that is often community supported against people of African descent. So that brings us back to the difficult stories, the challenging, the painful stories that sometimes people really don't want to bring up, but that are going to help you to elucidate what happens in your family story. So a couple of great resources to look at for this sort of information to find out if something happened in your family that might be painful would be to look at something like the Lynching in America report by the Equal Justice Initiative. Withoutsanctuary.org is a really interesting website that frankly is really painful, and you should be warned before you go there that this is a website that focuses on the story of lynching and that uses a lot of illustrations from postcards that were created from photos of Black bodies that had been brutalized during lynchings. And it's been created as a way for people to not be able to look away and to understand that these are things that actually happened and to understand the ways in which communities supported them. So just be aware before you go to that website that there's a lot of challenging content on there. If you want to step back to slavery, there's some really interesting resources to dig into there. And in particular, as you think about the transition out of slavery, there are these wonderful oral history projects and slave narratives that are compiled by a couple of different organizations. And a lot of them you can find, in particular, the ones from the Federal Writers Project through the Library of Congress. A lot of the narratives were created by the Federal Writers Project through the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression as a way to keep writers employed. And this is at a time when they realized that the remaining people who had actually experienced slavery were actually getting really, really old and passing away. And so they sent writers out to interview these individuals who oftentimes were children when they had been experiencing enslavement. And so they would ask them questions about what was life like and who were your owners and where were you living and tell us all of your experiences. Now, it's important to know that a number of the interviewers of those enslaved people were white individuals, and in fact were sometimes the descendants of the people who had kept the very interviewees and their families enslaved. So there's some interesting power dynamics that might have influenced the ways that people responded to questions that they were asked. There's also some very interesting ways in which dialect plays a role in the representations of how people of African descent spoke. So you want to maybe take with a grain of salt the language that is being used by people in these interviews, because it is known that sometimes the white interviewers would actually record the interviews in a much stronger dialect than the language with which the people actually spoke because they wanted it to seem more authentically Black. So that's a thing to be aware of. There's also some wonderful research out there, for example, the Beyond Kin Project, that's working to make sure that people who are descended from slave owning families can share their information about the people that their families enslaved with people of African descent who were enslaved by those families. So for so many of us, people of African descent, some of the records are difficult to find because they are kept sort of privately within families. And so a number of individuals through several projects like the Beyond Kin Project are trying to find ways to bring the 2 points together to make sure that people of African descent are able to access that information. universities and colleges now are actively working in a number of cases to better understand their relationships to slavery. And so, for example, the University Studying Slavery Project is a consortium of a number of different American universities that are trying to share all of the resources that they have, the names, the primary sources, the documentation, all of the different things, so that folks who believe that their family members may have been owned by universities, or that their family members may have somehow contributed to the success of those places, can actually sort of pour through the records and see what information there is to be found in those. It's really fascinating work. And then you might want to dig even deeper into slavery and start to understand, okay, well, at different points in time, where would people have come from in West Africa, and to which locations would they have been taken? What are the names of the ships? How many people would have been carried on them? What are the stops that they would have made? And so on and so forth. If you're interested in that, slavevoyages.org is an excellent place to check out. You might also want to look at runaway slave ads. So for freedom seekers who are leaving their homes or the places where they have been enslaved to seek their own freedom, when they leave, they're actually breaking the law by stealing themselves. And so owners will often place ads in newspapers that are really descriptive about features that a person might have, how tall they are, how light or dark skinned they are, what clothing they may be wearing or carrying with them, what special skills they might have, and so on and so forth. And so it might be possible for you to make a connection between people that you've been researching and some of the runaway slave ads that you come across. And so what you want to do, there's projects for this all across the United States, particularly on the East Coast and in the South. It's worth it to do a Google search for like Virginia runaway slave ads or Massachusetts runaway slave ads to see what you can find. And then what happens towards the end of the period of enslavement when you've got families that have been broken up in all sorts of different ways? Well, what you discover is that people of African descent are trying to put their families back together, whether they were sold away, whether people ran away, or so on and so forth. You find that people actually start placing ads in newspapers like the Christian Recorder, which is the mouthpiece of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And you find them saying, the last time that I saw my family was at such and such a location. My brothers and sisters have these names and they were owned by so and so. I'm living at such and such a location. Pastors, please read this notice out in your churches. Newspaper publishers, please publish this in your newspapers so that they can spread the word all across the United States and try to build their families back. These ads are beautiful and heartbreaking, and sometimes they actually do have happy endings. If you search for last seen finding family after slavery, you will actually find a wonderful digital project that's digging into all of this and actually digitizing images of these ads and transcribing them. You also want to look for, as you're doing your research, what is the support that you can find from other like-minded individuals? So what you see on screen here are actually pictures of the genealogy group that I'm a member of in Philadelphia, the African American Genealogy Group. There are chapters of other genealogical organizations, and especially OGS, which is the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society, which has chapters all over the country. There are also independent ones like my genealogy group, but organizations that are supporting genealogical researchers, family historians, whether they are African American like mine is and like OGS chapters are, or whether they're just sort of for any researchers and they might be affiliated with the historical society or archives or something like that. See what support you can get so that you have other folks to share your nerdy stories with and folks who can help you get over brick walls. It's really useful to have a group like that. So I will end just again by lifting up the fact that if you want to learn more about my own research, you can visit www.kinterested.blogspot.com. But really what I want to say is you can do this. Do not let all of the concerns, the challenges, feelings of shame around slavery, feelings about it being too overwhelming, don't let that stand in your way. Seek out resources. Continue to look for presentations like this one, listen to podcasts, look at the books, go to the different websites, and start to make out a research plan. What do you want to know? What is the information you're really looking for? Start plotting it out, start walking that path, and before you know it, you'll be on your bike and you'll be riding along getting all this information. So good luck. and happy researching.